Welcome back to my disembodied voice. Now, death is an inevitable part of life, and loss comes to us all if we live long enough. But what exactly is grief? How does it affect us? Does it really have stages? And what movies have shown grief effectively on screen? Well, for today's video, join me as we look at grief via bereavement and how our brains process it. Now, for reference, the long established 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But are there really 5 stages of grief? Well, let's take a brief history lesson here. Back in the 1960s, psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross researched how the dying process affects people. Her classic 1969 book On Death and Dying brought the prognosis of death into the limelight and discussed how people processed their mortality. So, the 5 stages of grief is a model developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 1960s based on interviews with over 200 dying people and wasn't actually intended for people who had lost a loved one. It was meant for those who'd been told they were going to die. So her model was basically intended to describe how the dying come to terms with their impending death and vacillate through these stages. However, over time, the model became interpreted as an orderly progression and then applied to people who grieve over the death of a loved one. Now, many scholars of mental health and bereavement feel that this model actually does harm, it brings unnecessary suffering, and it doesn't bring comfort to people who are grieving. And they feel this because grief is a deeply subjective experience and there is no time frame to it. And in other words, that means it's through your own frame of reference. You interpret it as you do, not necessarily as other people do, and how you deal with something differs from other people. And it's argued amongst scholars that it would be great if grieving was such a simple process that could be described in stages and also handy to know what to expect with each stage and how long each stage would last. I mean, wouldn't it be great if there was a grief to relief app we could all work through and cure ourselves within, 6 weeks? But in real life, grieving is far more complicated and a bewildering process. And decades of research on grief and mourning have now debunked this 5-stage model and said it does more harm than good. But what is the harm? Many of us do go through neat stages of grief. We tend to turn to this model as if it were a recipe or a prescription, and we hope to measure our progress through it. But when grief doesn't conform to these stages, we worry that we're doing it wrong or that we're failing to adjust, and then other people around us can get worried and say they've been feeling like this for far too long, they need to move on, without really appreciating, again, that everyone is different. However, today we're going to take those 5 emotions and we're going to apply them not necessarily as stages, but just separate emotions that you might feel. Now, I've spent a long time debating using these 5 emotions, but for today's video, we're going to take 5 movies and look how they deal at each of these 5 emotions, not necessarily through a time frame or through stages, and we're going to go through each emotion of grief and treat them as emotions following a death, take a movie, and then go through the biological, emotional, and social factors that affect our characters. So today, our flow-through chart for our 5 emotions that you experience post-grief, much like the 5 stages of grief, are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Oh, and spoiler alerts for the 5 movies we're going to cover today. Right then, let's crack on. Okay, let's start with denial. The refusal to accept someone's death, which, whilst a perfectly natural defence mechanism, impedes the grieving process via suppression, avoidance, and withholding of emotions. And for this section, we're going to go right back to 1973 and a movie which has one of the most harrowing openings of all time and a truly gut-punching end scene. I'm talking about Don't Look Now. Starring Julie Christie and the late great Donald Sutherland, the film opens with the traumatic death of the couple's daughter, Christine, who drowns. A truly heartbreaking scene. We see Donald Sutherland carrying the child's body from the water, and this sets the film in motion as the couple move to Venice. Donald Sutherland starts working on restoring an old church, and Julie Christie encounters an odd pair of sisters who state they have an occultic gift. Anyway, mix in a serial killer, visions of a child running around in a red coat exactly like the one Donald Sutherland's daughter died in, and lots of haunting premonitions from the strange sisters. And what you have at the end is a truly memorable movie with a real brutal closing scene. Now, in terms of denial, Donald Sutherland has successfully suppressed his feelings to focus on his work, the restoration of an old church, but Christine's death still looms over the couple. Unlike Donald Sutherland, Julie Christie is overcome with grief, caught between depression, and is emotionally overwhelmed. Now, Donald Sutherland is a rational and analytical man. He is sceptical of the two sisters they encounter in Venice, and generally he is being very male by bottling, suppressing, and just getting on with things. After all, as he says, she's dead. Move on. Donald Sutherland's refusal to acknowledge his own grief and the possibility of a supernatural realm forces him to suppress these feelings and maintain a rigid facade of rationality. And it's this rigid facade which ultimately isolates him from Julie Christie and also the world around him. Now, let's not conflate rationality too much with denial, as both are perfectly natural in context, but Donald Sutherland doesn't grieve like Julie Christie does, as she moves through the natural grieving process of losing a child and suffering a deep depression whilst clinging to notions of wanting to know what happens beyond the grave and feeling remorse. Like I said, rather than follow the 5 stages exactly, she's going through natural emotions, like depression and bargaining. Donald Sutherland, on the other hand, merely keeps affirming she's dead and suppresses all of his feelings, whilst Julie Christie continues to believe if her daughter is living in a spiritual realm, what is she feeling? What is she thinking? Can I talk to her? Julie Christie has grief, Donald Sutherland has denial, and they keep drifting apart as a couple. But in terms of our brains, where is denial rooted? Denial is negatively associated with strength of connectivity between the rostral anterior cingulate cortex and the regions of the frontal lobe, precentral gyri, left ventromedial prefrontal cortex, left orbitofrontal cortex, limbic system, left amygdala, left hippocampus, and left parohippocampal gyrus, as well as the occipital lobes and the cerebellum. Basically, to put that in layman's terms, the rostral anterior cingulate cortex is positioned between the limbic and cortical structures to integrate emotion with cognition and is thereby primed to influence amygdala-dependent learning. Amygdala being the almond-shaped emotional fear factory of our fight or flight response and a very necessary part of our survival. This anterior front portion is associated with motor execution, vocalization, pain perception, emotional processing, and autonomic regulation. Studies suggest that the rostral anterior cingulate cortex is involved in the regulation of emotional processing, and any hyperactivity in this area, along with the medial prefrontal cortex, is associated with self-referential processing of negative emotional stimuli, which is a characteristic of depression. However, in terms of denial, the rostral anterior cingulate cortex has a big role in regulating emotions as it's connected to the amygdala. And whilst not directly studied in the context of denial, the rostral anterior cingulate cortex's role in emotional processing and error detection suggests that it could be involved in the cognitive and emotional processes that underlie denial, which is a defense mechanism against difficult truths or realities. Now, denial was first described by the famed psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, who described it as refusing to acknowledge upsetting facts about external events and internal ones, including memories, thoughts, and feelings. And there are a few signs that you or someone you know might be using denial as a defense mechanism. Some common signs are, and we'll refer these to Don't Look Now, you refuse to talk about the problem. Donald Sutherland refuses to talk about his daughter's death. You find ways of justifying your behaviour. Donald Sutherland uses rationality. You persist in a behaviour despite negative consequences. Again, Donald Sutherland has frequent warnings about his own safety, but carries on. You avoid thinking about the problem. In Don't Look Now, Donald Sutherland just buries himself in work and uses this to help his suppression. So, in Don't Look Now, Donald Sutherland is firmly trapped in denial with the emotive part of the limbic system kept compartmentalised from the thinking part of the brain by the rostral anterior cingulate cortex. And we have a man now who is refusing to let his emotions connect with his cognition and, alongside multiple warnings, causes himself to distance himself from his wife and stops him from accepting any other point of view. And because he sticks to his rationality and he keeps this suppression going, it leads to his demise at the tragic end of the film. Now we come to anger, a perfectly natural emotion for anyone who is grieving, but when held onto and imbibed as a pervasive belief system, it becomes toxic and self-destructive. In Promising Young Woman, Cassie is a medical student dropout who is devastated at the suicide of her best friend, Nina Fisher. You see, Nina accused the apex student of the class, Al Monroe, of rape, but between the police and the university, she was discredited and the case collapsed and Nina took her own life in despair. Cassie now spends her nights either staring at screensaver photos of Nina or going out and acting drunk, getting a nice guy to take her home, and when said nice guy tries to take advantage of her, she turns the tables and reveals herself as sober and feeling somewhat accusatory, which could lead to a kind of life or career ruining consequence. Cassie has stagnated since Nina died. She's dropped out of medical school, she works in a coffee bar, her parents want her out the house, her friends know she's far too clever and good to be working in a coffee bar, and even her new love interest cannot crack her bitter and hardened exterior. You see, Cassie is furious at Al Monroe never being brought to justice, so she sets out on a mission to exact revenge on those who failed her, be it friends, teachers, or even a
crusty, bitter old dean.
The point here is that Cassie's career, life, relationships, and happiness have all been poisoned and infected with the sepsis of malignant anger, and stuck in a single emotion from a moment in time she cannot get past, she is unable to move on from the anger which is slowly poisoning her soul and making her genuinely impossible to love. Like I said at the start of the video essay, the so-called 5 stages of grief have no time frame, and the way that people approach things is different. Some people don't have denial, they go straight into huge amounts of depression, and how long that lasts is a very subjective time. So, stuck within the post-traumatic stress disorder of seeing her friend die and reliving the injustice every day, Cassie is frozen in a moment in time and her anger consumes her, and she repeatedly refuels this anger by looking at photos of Nina when she's on her own or recreating the scene where Nina was drunk and raped. It strongly suggested that her rape wasn't necessarily violent but more of a mental capacity to consent due to intoxication. And by recreating the same moment over and over again, only to reveal that she isn't drunk and therefore can accuse the men who are undressing her, she is trying to fix a moment in time which she cannot accept. Lost to rage, Cassie endures an acerbic, homeostasis of misery until she finally lets her guard down, only to be betrayed by the man she has been falling in love with as a certain video emerges of Nina's ordeal and this man's presence at the ordeal. And much like Donald Sutherland in Don't Look Now, Cassie is on a collision course with a doomed ending due to being pervasively stuck within the emotion of anger. Now, like denial, anger also affects the limbic system and amygdala and is kept from connecting with cognition by the rostral anterior cingulate cortex, and also the anterior cingulate gyrus, which lies between the brain's frontal lobe thinking cortex and limbic system. During such episodes, the emotional system of the brain becomes more active, while the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, gets suppressed. This can lead to irrational or regrettable behaviour, intense outbursts, or even violence at its worst. However, once adopted as a singular mood and fuelled by repeated stimulus which keeps the emotion on a reactivating loop, our personality and frame of reference warps and, rather than interact with the surrounding world, we view it through acid-tinted spectacles of malignancy, projection, bitterness, and a disavowal of our very essence. With amygdala-centred thinking, the body is stuck in an emotive soup of sickness and, as Cassie poisons herself with hatred and anger, there is no logical thinking, only vengeful projection as she is slowly dissolved inside her own acidic brine. And by the time the end comes, there is no other method other than crossing the line she cannot come back from. But, oddly enough, she does engage the logical brain for a contingency plan, as she knows she is potentially walking into her own grave. It's ironic that the only time she really engages this logical thinking is when she's walking to her own death, which is caused by her inability to let go of injustice and bathe within the anger she feels. Promising Young Woman deals with someone who is really beyond help and lost to anger, but upon being pulled out from that and teetering on the very precipice of acceptance, when her worst fears are confirmed, she welcomes the anger back like a Sith Lord from Star Wars and lets it twist her up. Anger is a healthy emotion at times and a natural response to bad things. However, anger is a negative emotion if we hold on to it long term. But whilst it's negative, it can also feel like a very comforting defence mechanism, and it's very hard to pull someone out of it. Like many other things, anger is quite addictive and quite comforting to stay within. Okay, bargaining. So overwhelmed, the individual will make a deal with a higher power to somehow bring back the loved one who is forever dead and gone. And for this one, let me introduce you to a low-budget Scottish movie called Kill. In Kill, three brothers lure their father to the woods with the intention of killing him. You see, we are told, through flashbacks, that said father was a real swine and regularly beat his children, locked some of them in a box for up to 3 days, force-fed their mother some truly unpleasant things, and was generally vile for 95% of the time. Anyway, after the plan goes slightly wrong, one of the brothers finally gets a shot off and said father is buried in a shallow grave. Except when they return for a rather important key they have accidentally buried by mistake, the body has vanished. Now, the favourite son and youngest brother, who looks a little like a young Mark Owen from the boy band Take That, was spared many beatings and has a guilt complex over his mother's death, and when the brothers encounter a web of dead rabbits, odd symbols and occultic paraphernalia, it turns out that Mark Owen is trying to make a deal with the afterlife to bring his mother back. Lost to this bargaining, unable to accept his mother's death, which I won't spoil here, Mark Owen generally believes he can bring her back to life and they can be a happy family again. Part delusion and part amalgamation of denial and anger and grief, Mark Owen is dealing with the loss and guilt by the pretense that he can somehow change it. Much like Cassie, who is so lost to anger that she's unreachable, Mark Owen's prefrontal cortex is switched off and overridden by the limbic system and the amygdala. His cingulate gyrus, which links emotional responses to decision making, is also impaired, and he is led via the amygdala and limbic system, which is emotive and now clouded with delusion. Now, the amygdala, the tiny almond-shaped brain structure associated with emotions, memory and learning, plays a fundamental role in emotional reactions, including anger and fear. It's an alarm alerting you to danger, but it sometimes has a bit of a hair trigger. It has a tendency to overreact to things that are actually completely harmless. When something triggers feelings of anger, whether it's a minor irritation or a legitimate threat, the amygdala hits the panic button, which signals another part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which then releases lots of chemicals into the bloodstream like cortisol and adrenaline. So, as Mark Owen is guilty and scared, he is being driven by emotions and there is no rationality connecting these emotions, and he has convinced himself he can bring his mother back. In Promising Young Woman, Cassie was lost to anger and, although she was aware she couldn't bring Nina back, she was repeating the capacity rape scenario and trying to fix it over and over again because she blamed herself and wanted to lash out. She also wanted to bring random strangers to justice even though they had nothing to do with Nina's terrible ordeal. And in Don't Look Now, Donald Sutherland was repressing all of his emotions via denial and living with just the rational part of his brain. For Mark Owen, however, it's gone so far that he honestly believes he can make everything better by raising a corpse. And as we know, that isn't possible, because even if it were, we can't put the raised mummy back into the ideal form because she'd be decomposed and rather smelly from being buried for several months. But such is his guilt, post-traumatic stress and anger and all of these other things going on in his head, and the rationality part is switched off. The poor boy's only comfort is this bizarre fantasy that he can live in where somehow he can put it right. He can take all the guilt and pain away and somehow put it right, and it's that bargaining which keeps him going. However, sometimes the rostral anterior cingulate cortex and the entirety of the anterior cingulate gyrus is working too hard and is too hyperactive, and rather than getting anger or bargaining from purely the emotive brain, we get depression, a pervasive low mood which cannot be lifted no matter what the afflicted person tries. And for this one, we're going to look at Peter Jackson's The Lovely Bones, which could have been used for any of these emotions on our flow-through chart because each character in that deals with grief differently, but overall, they are all lost to the helpless feeling of depression and the symptoms that this brings. In The Lovely Bones, Susie Salmon is lured to a house by a neighbour called George Harvey, and, upon a revelation later on, she realises that she never left the house and was in fact murdered by him. She is now stuck in a form of limbo where she hasn't fully crossed over to heaven, but she can see what's happening on earth. Unable to let go and cross over fully, despite other spirits telling her to move on, the film deals with Susie seeing just how evil George Harvey is whilst her family search for justice. Now, it's her family I want to focus on here because they all deal with grief in different ways. But at the same time, it's all very stuck in depression. Be it alcohol, affairs, sinking further and away from each other, finding solace in isolation or deliberate alienation, the family shatter as grief tears them apart. Now, like I said before, we all have our own way of dealing with grief, and depression is a perfectly natural and necessary emotion for us to move through, but like anger, if held onto, it becomes something that can rot us from the inside. Coming back to our old friend, the rostral anterior cingulate cortex, studies suggest that the rostral anterior cingulate cortex is involved in the regulation of emotional processing, like I said earlier on in the video, and hyperactivity in this area, alongside the medial prefrontal cortex, is associated with self-referential processing of negative emotional stimuli, which is a characteristic of depression. When someone dies, we think a lot. We miss someone, how we want them back, how can we possibly go on? We relive things, reprocess things time and time again, and our world warps through our frame of reference as we are now lonely, isolated and missing the piece that makes us whole. Like I said, depression is natural and we all need to go through this process, but when the hypothalamus is impacted, our serotonin is low and we are processing negative emotions and reliving things over and over again. And with the rostral anterior cingulate cortex hyperactive, that balance of overthinking and over emotion just is a soup of a mess. Low mood can swallow us, and this leads people to stop washing, stop going out, stop talking to other people, and basically doing everything in a normal routine, and it creates an isolative state of withdrawal. And when we're depressed, we do things that give us a bit of a comforting hug inside our own loneliness, like having an affair or getting drunk. And getting some cold comfort, like the thrill of an orgasm or that heightened state of being drunk, offers us something apart from the great void of harrowing nothingness that we can't see through. Alcohol and affairs are just two things which add feelings to a numb or low frame of reference, and in The Lovely Bones, the family are all filling that void and getting their form of a hug from different things which offer scant but intense comfort to their lives, which are affected on a pervasive scale. So, be it alcohol or sex, those moments in time are helping them feel something through this awful feeling of just nothingness and low and misery. But it's not all bad. And grief is something we all pass through, and one day we should all reach an emotion where we can move on a little, and that is called acceptance. The memories are filed in the neocortex, we reach a sense of peace and nostalgia with our departed loved ones, and we learn to live again, even if the new life is missing someone special. And no film offers anything quite like acceptance other than Pixar's Up, which, after breaking your heart in the opening montage, takes you on an emotive story through so many stages and points of grief before lifting you up with a truly wonderful ending. In the movie Up, Carl Fredricksen is going to fulfill a promise to his late wife by moving the house to Paradise Falls, which was a promise that he made to her. However, upon the house taking off with a cluster of many balloons, it seems a young Boy Scout called Russell is along for the ride, and so we begin a formula as tried and tested as time itself, as two people who have nothing in common are thrown together and have to survive and start to get along. Anyway, mix in some peril, some daring do, and a plot with dogs wearing collars that enable them to talk, and a bitter old antagonist, and the film ends with Carl unknowingly fulfilling his promise of taking the house to Paradise Falls, whilst also accepting life without his wife and deciding to move on and make the most of his existence. And the house plays an important part in the movie as the movie progresses, the house becomes more of a hindrance, and Carl is determined to hold on to the house and take it to Paradise Fall, and it stops him forming a relationship with Russell or moving on from his grief, or even getting them both home safely, and Carl seems more concerned about the damage the house is receiving other than the danger that he and Russell are in. Eventually, though, Carl realises just how much the house has held him back, and when browsing through his wife's adventure book, as he turns the pages, he's surprised to discover that the blank pages she showed him years ago are now all filled with pictures of his and his wife's life together. Suddenly, Carl realises that even though he and his wife were never able to visit Paradise Falls together, they did have a wonderful life. Then, armed with this new insight of acceptance and filing all those memories and all those feelings inside the logical part of the neocortex, disengaging the emotional brain and finding a way to move forward, Carl lets go of the house in order to get him and Russell home safely. It's a truly beautiful moment of emotional, cognition, spiritual, nostalgic, and the soulful benefits of accepting something as part of life, making peace with the past, and realising that our journey goes on, even if people aren't here to enjoy it with us. Whereas other characters in our flow through have met their downfalls or hit rock bottom through the darker emotions that grief brings, Carl comes out the other side with an acceptance of what has happened and that he can't revisit or fix it, but he can only cherish it for what it was and accept that those parts of his life are gone, but they were wonderful, but there are still things to enjoy in life, such as a new life with Russell. It's basically a reset, a reboot, a cathartic outcome for the brain. What acceptance does to the brain, I suppose. Ooh, now that's a video for another day, maybe. Anyway, that's it for this week's video. So remember that psychology is cool. Please like, share and subscribe, as more subs means more vids, and even leave a comment or start a discussion, as healthy debate is always welcome on here. And as ever, until next time, I'll catch you later.
And unless movies and TV have lied to me, it's a crusty, bitter old Dean.